welcome to our second Agency Masters of 2024. And today's session is all around utilisation, which I know is a term that you've probably used or heard of within your agencies. So today we're trying in this session to explore why it matters to agencies, how to calculate it, how to improve it, and the question that we ask time and time again. You work with hundreds of agencies. What does good look like? So we'll look at that too. Before we jump into all that, for those who don't know me or haven't joined previous webinars, I'm Steve. I'm one of the co-founders of Agency Works. And I've been working with agencies for over 20 years to help them improve processes, become more efficient, and hopefully become more profitable. And as usual with these sessions, I've dragged on my colleague Kate to join me, our newly promoted principal consultant. Kate, congratulations.
Thank you.
As Kate has previous experience working with agencies, so she knows a lot more about these probably topics from a practical sense than I do. So thanks for joining me, Kate.
Thanks for that rather lovely intro there, Steve. Thank you very much. Yes, I worked for within agencies for the last sort of 20 odd years before coming here at the Agency Works a couple of years ago. Starting off sort of AE level, all those many moons ago, doing things like the repro sort of the CMYK film, sending it out to sort of European magazines. So that's kind of how long I've been going for. Yeah, up till sort of recent times where work mainly in ops and support in finance. So that's kind of where my main sort of main experience is, I guess. Yeah.
Cool.
So sort of kicking this webinar off, I just wanted to touch on what sort of utilisation rate is really. And I think that term is banded across agencies all the time, and it can mean different things to different people. And although it feels kind of like a cold and scary term, I was looking up the other day what it actually meant when I was doing my prep for the webinar. And according to the Cambridge Dictionary, it means to use something in the most effective way. But as I put in my LinkedIn post the other day, something within agencies, that something is people, and they may not like the pressure that the utilisation rate can bring. But actually, on the flip side of that, in real life, the real life business, those people's hours are your product. It's what you're selling. And those hours are perishable. Once they've gone forever. And so you definitely need to have some sort of metrics around them. And that kind of brings us on nicely to the slide that's on the screen at the moment, sort of utilisation versus recovery. And I think quite often the two get sort of mixed up. The muddies the water when you kind of try and bring those two reports in together. They are two, in my opinion, they're two sort of separate reports. They work alongside one another. They're a bit like Mouldy and Sculler. What's in Mouldy and Sculler? You know the ones. They work together. So your utilisation report is how much time is spending on your chargeable work versus your non-chargeable work, having a rate to that and seeing if you can sort of get to that target rate. Whereas your recovery is taking those hours, those chargeable hours, and ensuring that you've actually charged for them. So they're two different things, but both very important.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, and in terms of kind of, we get asked why you track utilisation. I think there's a number of reasons why it matters, and we've kind of picked out a few of hopefully the top ones. I think the first one is around forecasting, because until you define your utilisation target, it will be difficult to set your forecasts. So whether that's forecasting for income or for capacity or for revenue, you need to know what you have available so you can forecast them. And that kind of leads into showing available hours by resource. And we'll look at how we calculate this a little bit later on, but we need to know how many hours we have to deliver or sell for each team or each resource. And we need to know then, if we do know this, then we can help us kind of drive our capacity and revenue forecasting. Visibility on internal stuff. Yeah, quite simply, this will help me track how much chargeable work is going on client work and how much is going on internal stuff. And if it is going on internal stuff, what is that internal stuff? And we can report then a bit clearly on what people are doing. The big one for me, though, is the recruitment decisions and helping me kind of make those. We have lots of examples of agencies who are constantly busy, or their teams are constantly busy. But if they're not hitting the agreed utilization rates, do you want to go out and add more resource into that team just to add more kind of cost to the agency if they're not hitting the utilization figures? Or on the flip side, if they are hitting the utilization figures, then it's about supporting that decision. So we know that the guys are busy, we know they're working on chargeable work, so actually it could support you bringing in more headcount. Yeah, simply it can show me why it matters is it can show me who is under and overutilized. So this can be by individual team or by person or by type of person. So we can highlight kind of where we've got gaps in that. And that kind of feeds into where there's room for more work. So can we sell more hours? Do we have enough work? If we have a design team, are we selling enough design hours in order for them to have enough chargeable work to work on? Because if we're not, then that can have an impact on them hitting their targets. The one thing that we mentioned, I get asked at from a speaking to kind of prospective agencies and yourself, Kate, when you're talking to your clients, this idea about what is good, what looks good, what rates should we be achieving? And I think that's different, isn't it, comparing on kind of where agencies are in terms of geographically, but also what we can see on this slide. What's your thoughts on the kind of rates that most of your agencies look to achieve?
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that I get asked a lot, especially when one of my main roles within the agency that works at the moment is sort of onboarding synergist. And it's definitely a big question that I will get asked by most clients at some point, sort of like, what is good? What is a good utilization rate? And I think normally what we would say is that if you're hitting 65% across the board, then you're doing pretty good. That is what good looks like. And in fact, the 2023 Wow company bench press report agrees with that. So that's kind of how that other people are agreeing with us as well. But that can sort of vary massively across your team. So it doesn't mean that everyone is 65%. It could be that your more junior levels or your creatives are more sort of hitting the 70-75% level. Whereas it would drop down to sort of 30% to your director level staff. And that's because they're more internally focused, and it sort of allows them to work on that, your own business rather than in it. And utilization will fluctuate as well. So it depends on what your team are working on. Maybe they're working on a big internal project, which will take them away from that client work. And I think one thing for me to remember is that, utilization rate, it's not a measure on how hard somebody is working. Like, it doesn't mean that they're working harder because they've got a higher rate. And actually, if you're reaching higher rates, especially if you're reaching like 100% utilization, which obviously is impossible, but if you are, then that means your staff are overworked. It means that they're not concentrating on any sort of upskilling or personal development. So if you are hitting that 100%, that's a big warning sign. And lastly, the thing to sort of consider when sort of around what looks good is what sort of agency are you? What culture do you have? Are you more of an agency that will down tools on a Friday lunchtime and sort of get around the foosball table, have a couple of beers? That might be that is going to impact your utilization rate. That's going to bring your utilization rate down. But it will make your agency a happier one to work in, and you might just be able to retain that staff and that talent that's so hard to acquire.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Whether it's looking at utilization rates or any other metrics, it's that idea of what looks good for you might not be good for somebody else. So I think it's kind of subjective, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this slide that we're going to be looking at now is sort of how to calculate utilization rates. It's a very simple calculation. We're looking at how many chargeable hours we think that somebody can achieve in a working week. And we have a very simple equation on the screen, which actually gets quite a high utilization rate, but we'll go on to that later. And here we're looking at sort of, if we think somebody can achieve 30 hours of chargeable work per week, we divide that by how many contracted hours we have. So in this example, it's 37.5. And that gives us 0.8 times that by 100, and it gives us 80% utilization rate, which, as I mentioned before, I feel is quite high. And I think there's things to sort of think around that, and there's some, setting expectations to manage to get to that rate. But there's also sort of a process you can go through to enable you to do that. So I think the first one on there is interviewing your team members and asking them how much time they spend on billable work, but also what else do they have to do within the agency? So what else is pulling them away from that work, to give you an idea of, how many chargeable hours they potentially have got. And by doing that, you're giving them autonomy, and you're also getting their buy-in a little bit, So the next one that's on there is sort of reviewing those previous timesheets. So looking at that data that you get. Obviously, you need accurate timesheet data, which is another subject entirely. But looking at that timesheet data, look at it over a broader period as you can, sort of up to a year if possible, because then you're taking in everybody's holidays, you're taking in the bank holidays, you're taking in if they're being dragged onto new business, like pitches, or if they're doing some internal work, you're getting that whole big picture about, how many hours are actually chargeable for somebody. And then on the flip side of that, looking at what you've got coming up. So maybe you've got a big internal project coming in. Maybe you want that person to be working more on pitch work or new business. And all of that is going to go into how many hours that person can work. And then the last one on there is just kind of going back to the slide that was on previously, is taking that information and then calculating it. So taking doing the calculation that was on the last slide. Sorry, Steve, got to a bit of tongue-tied there.
We are live. In terms of that calculation, I think it's that calculation filters through to the kind of forecasting capacity and revenue that I touched on previously. So we need to do that calculation that you mentioned to get this. So you calculated your realistic utilization rate that Kate mentioned. You know how much time you have available to sell, so you can calculate your capacity, and therefore, once we've done that, we can then calculate revenue per person per team and for the agency overall. And that can be done by using the formula that's on the screen now, which you might not be able to see. It's kind of quite small at the bottom, but the two things that we need to look at are, first thing is chargeable hours. So that's taking your utilization rate and timesing it by the number of workable hours. So we've got the utilization rate. How many workable hours do we've got? Now we do a calculation that's looking at 52 weeks in the year times 5 days a week. Then we deduct public holidays. You deduct your staff allowance for holidays as well. We then divide your working week by 5, and then we times the two together. Sounds quite complicated, but we can send you the calculation. So I've done that calculation, and we've worked out that we've got 1,740 workable hours in the year. But if I actually times that by the number of potential chargeable hours, in my case, 75%, that figure is more like 1,300 chargeable hours in a year. So that gets me my calculation of how many chargeable hours we've got. I then need to look at our achievable revenue. So that's then taking those chargeable hours, the 1,300, and simply timesing it by the charge rate that you're looking at. And that could be, in my example, £100 an hour. So your 1,300 hours times £100 an hour. I can then have a revenue forecast of £130,000 for that year if we were to achieve 75% utilization. So hopefully that's quite straightforward, and we can send you examples of that. So that's how I get to that metric. So that's my kind of revenue forecast, my fee income forecast, if you like. But as we mentioned previously, that doesn't guarantee that we're going to recover all that work. So we may hit the utilization, but we may not be paid for it. So you need to ensure that you're still selling all the hours that you've got. Otherwise, you might have designers hitting their utilization, but you're not getting paid for it. So you need to ask yourself, does your proposition enable you to sell those hours week in, week out? So if you know your utilization rates it can make it easier to manage your capacity. So hopefully you're selling the right work and that you've got the right people to deliver it. Once you set up your metrics and your targets, it's about how we report on this. And so we need to track everybody's hours to monitor those preset metrics. So whether you're doing this in Excel, whether you're doing it in a timesheet system, hopefully most of you on the call will be doing it in a wonderful system like Synergist. And this is where we can get the kind of important metrics and we can track live. So you might recognize the performance dashboard that's on the slide. Here we can see live visibility of things like chargeable versus non-chargeable, and that could be by person or by team. But we can also see things like hours sold as well, and that can be broken down by team and by resource. So this is a really useful metric to have, and I think not only for senior members of the team, but also for you to share with all your team members, because they need to kind of own that time. The one big caveat with this and a lot of reports that we get from systems is this is assuming that people have actually posted their timesheets. So again, that's another thing to bring into consideration. But if they are, then again, we get this live visibility. So actually we can make changes to things live as opposed to doing kind of reporting at the end of the month. And then, as Kate said, that time's been and gone.
Absolutely. So we've talked a lot around sort of the chargeable time, but we need to know kind of how time is spent. So we need to look at that non-chargeable work. We need our team members to be filling in their timesheets in full. If they're only doing half of their week, then how do we know that they're recording all their chargeable time? To enable them to do that, you need some non-chargeable charge codes or categories, depending on kind of what you call them in your business. Now, generally, we want to try and keep these to a minimum. If we've got a massive, great big long list of them, people will be like, well, where do I put my time for this or that, So we need to think about what people are going to put their time to and what we want to track as well. So business building, new business, maybe it's marketing for yourself, maybe it's actually going out and getting new business. So having codes around that can be really helpful. The other one is sort of professional development for your team. So you want your team to be able to upskill, you want them to be developing professionally and giving them time to be able to do that. So having codes around that can be really helpful as well. In that way as well, you're giving your team autonomy and you're giving them the availability to put time against what they're actually doing rather than just that big old bucket of admin. And absence, that's a nice, easy one. We've got holiday and sickness, that kind of thing. So that's easy to record. But that last one I just mentioned there, we've got the big old black hole on the screen at the moment, admin, that big bucket of just chuck it in there. There's no metrics around it. You can't get any sort of KPIs out of it. So, and I think I find this a lot with my clients, Steve. I don't know what you find, whether you find we get it a lot in our business.
Yeah, no, I think that whether you term it admin, whether you term it miscellaneous, it's that kind of dumping ground for anything other else that doesn't kind of fit into that framework. So you mentioned that framework's really important. You need to define where you want people to post that time. I mean, we all post time internally at the Agency Works. And, as a business, we wanted to look at where perhaps people were spending time on things like personal development and on improving LinkedIn profiles, or even gone down to this webinar. So we'll post our time after this session to our webinar category. So it's about kind of what you want to report on, but it's having categories that, as you said, that people can use and not having that dumping ground. And miscellaneous admin is kind of one that kind of tends to get used more than anything else. Definitely, yeah,
absolutely.
So in terms of kind of agencies that we've worked with and seeing agencies, and we've just done a recent case study, which is on a website for an agency, Armstrong, who've really kind of used the system to ramp up their utilization figures, which I think we can share with you. But in terms of getting it right, these are some of the things that we would suggest that you look at. So the first thing that I would bring in would be coming back to that selling the right amount of hours. If you don't sell enough hours, then you can't really expect your team to hit their figures. So you don't want to have one team that's massively overloaded and the other team kind of sitting around twiddling their thumbs. So the ideal scenario is that all team members have chargeable work to work on, But to do this, you do need to have a clear view of what's booked for each department. And if there are any gaps, that's where you want your new business team or your client team to hopefully kind of sell in the additional work to plug that capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of feeds in quite nicely to the next one, avoid overscheduling. You know, if you overbook people on a job, potentially they're going to finish early and then not have anything to do, wasting valuable hours. Or it might be that they can think, brilliant, I've got 4 hours now to work on this piece of work. I can make it look even more amazing than I could in the time I thought that I had for it. They'll spend all that time for it on that. So, you know, you have to really look about not overscheduling, making sure you've got the right time in for people to do certain tasks.
And to that point, if you have, then make sure the briefs are ready. You don't want to have work ready to go and people sat around because you haven't got the right documentation or briefs or estimates or tasks ready to pass on. So every minute that they're sat around waiting for that to come through is obviously kind of, you know, time that they could be spent doing chargeable work.
And making sure that you're training and upskilling equally. You know, if you've got senior people who are sort of overbooked, while you've got juniors sat around doing nothing, that's no good. So making sure that those juniors potentially are shadowing those senior people so they can potentially do the tasks next time. And just avoiding favoritism, which kind of goes a little bit back to that avoid scheduling that I just said a little bit earlier. So if you've got a certain creative that always works on one client, don't be giving them all that work where you've got another creative sat around doing nothing or not as much to do. So make sure you're avoiding that favoritism and you're sort of getting that work out equally.
Yeah, you see that a lot, don't you?
Mm.
Also, as well, I think having those kind of what we call filler jobs, you know, whether it's internal client work, new business, you know, non-urgent client work, staff development, it's stuff that if you do have capacity in the team that people can jump on, so they are not just kind of, you know, I'm not saying they'll sat around, but there are kind of additional projects that you can fit in to the schedule.
Yeah, definitely. And the next one kind of goes back to what I was just saying a couple of slides ago, is sort of making sure that you have a standard process and people knowing where they need to put their time. So if you can standardize, you can sort of template things, it's going to make everything a lot more efficient for people. And yeah, they'll know where to put their time.
And then I see this much more now that, you know, we're all working remotely and agencies are kind of have this hybrid approach. Do we need to invite everybody to every Teams meeting? So if we can simplify tasks or ditch unnecessary meetings, then hopefully that will free up more time to work on client work and not just internal calls that you get roped into.
And not fudging those timesheets. So making sure you're tracking time accurately. So, you know, it goes back to another point as well. If you're booked in for 4 hours on something, don't just timesheet those 4 hours because it's easier. Make sure people are tracking their time correctly on jobs. Otherwise, you're never going to know whether you're over-servicing a client. And also, you don't know then if people are actually doing their internal stuff and doing their personal development. So accuracy is definitely key.
Definitely, well, doing timesheets to start with is the first thing, isn't it? And then
That is most agencies would agree with you there, Steve, I think.
So in terms of kind of getting towards the end, in terms of what we would recommend as being kind of our top takeaways from this, I think for me, it's around communicating this internally. You talked about kind of interviewing the staff. I think they need to understand why you're tracking utilization. They may not like having a target associated to them, but they need to understand that actually, if they don't hit that target, it's not always on them. Because as we said before, if you've not sold enough hours, then potentially it could be kind of a bigger issue. So that communication internally, I think, is really important.
Yeah, so it's like a group decision rather than it coming down
they
from the
buy
top.
into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next one is sort of setting those realistic targets. So a lot earlier on in the webinar, we spoke about that, sort of making sure that you're actually setting realistic, you know, you're not just going like that in the air. We're actually looking at it and we're saying how much is actually a realistic target that people can achieve.
And once you set that target, the next one, you know, the charge code framework we touched on before, but it's having that, you know, the agreement, the categories in place, you know, not having the ability to dump time in black holes in miscellaneous categories. So then we can report much easier if we've got those agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last one is you touched on this just a few minutes ago, Steve, and it's quite a simple one, but I think it's a really important one, that if you've got work booked in or you're booking work in, making sure that that brief is ready and that you're not sort of slowing people down getting onto that work. So make sure it's booked correctly and make sure that you've got it briefed in and everything is ready to go.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kate. So that brings us to the end of today's session. Those 25 minutes have whizzed by. I hope you found it useful, and we managed to cover some of the stuff that could be useful for your agency. If you want to discuss it any further, do reach out to us at the Agency Works or via LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed this, then obviously our next master's topic will be on proper project planning, which is a mouthful, which we'll be pinging you details on later today, as we will with a copy of this recording. You might have seen as well that we've got a YouTube channel which has a number of the webinars, like kind of Jay's A game as well, and other kind of great content. So if you've got a spare 20 minutes free, do go and look at that. And if you want any other great insights, then the Agency Works website is always a good place to visit. So thanks once again. Thank you, Kate, for jumping on. I hope you have a great Valentine's Day.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you again soon. Cheers.
Brilliant. Cheers, Steve.